Hey everybody, I'm Stefan, the all-in nerd, back again to throw some great tips at you. And this time around, I'll head into the foundations of the miniature hobby. And hopefully I'll be able to give you some useful information, either if you're a complete beginner or if you've been into the hobby for a while. And first of all, I just want to point out that I'm absolutely not the greatest painter in the world, but I'm probably not the worst.
Yeah, you really should learn how to paint within the lines.
Yeah, and your base coating is quite sloppy. And I didn't even find the droids I was looking for.
And have you seen him try to paint faces?
Let's start, shall we? First of all, we need something to paint. What it's gonna be, it's entirely up to you. There's tons of different kinds of miniatures out there, so find something that you will like. If you have a local game shop in your area, I suggest that you go and check that out. It's great to support locally, especially if it's a smaller shop. And there you can get some help with finding what you're looking for. If you don't have something like that, then the internet is the place to go. There's so many places to find miniatures. And besides that, you have 3D printing. If you have a friend with a printer, there's a lot of free models to download and print when you're first getting started. And after that as well, of course. Depending on what you decide on, there might be some assembly required. Models from Dungeons & Dragons usually doesn't need any assembly, but miniatures from Warhammer and sometimes 3D prints do. But if you don't know what you want to paint, or it doesn't matter, then the easy way out is to buy a starter kit. Then you'll get the paint, the model, the brushes and the tools you need to put it all together. And talking about tools, let's see what we'll need if we want to be able to build a model from Games Workshop. Models usually come attached to a plastic frame called a sprue and needs to be cut off. For this we use cutters. The smaller ones are easier to use, and the ones with one flat side makes it easy to cut. You don't need a fancy or an expensive one to get started, and this applies to all the tools that I'll be talking about. To figure out which part to cut first, you check out the instructions that comes with the model. Make the cut a small bit away from the piece, so you don't accidentally cut into the model itself. Next you'll need a hobby knife. Carefully cut off the pieces of sprue that's still on the model. Pro tip: if you want your model to look extra good when painted, I suggest that you try to scrape off the mold lines that remain on the parts from the molding process. This is easily done with the backside of your hobby knife. It stings when you spent a lot of time painting your model, and when finished you notice that there's a big ugly mold line really sticking out. Then it's time to glue the pieces together. And there's a lot of different kinds of glues out there, all for different uses. This plastic glue from Citadel have a long nozzle which makes it handy. And use the glue sparingly, because it's easy to add too much. And it's also easy to forget to put the cap on between the uses though, so it might clog up. And if it does, just simply use a lighter and burn a bit on the end of the tip to unclog it. The other one is Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. This one is applied with a small brush that's attached to the cap. Compared to the Citadel glue, this is really thin, and if there is a gap in between the pieces, it'll be harder to use. But since it's really thin, it's smooth to add extra glue after the pieces are pressed together. I feel like these two types of glues really work well together. When putting it together, it can be smart to dry fit the pieces first, to find out exactly how they're supposed to fit. And after that you add some glue and hold the pieces together for a minute or so. Of course you can use super glue if you want. And when working with other materials than plastic, super glue is to be preferred. But try to keep the glue on the model. Now we decide if we want to have the model glued to the base or if we want to have them separate until after the painting is done. I'm gonna glue it on now. And then I'm gonna fix some texture on the base so it looks more natural. And for this I'm using PVA glue, which is also called wooden glue, school glue, white glue. And I put it on top of the base and pour some sand and small pebbles onto it. And this sand has been cleaned from germs by being baked in the oven for about 30 minutes. Pro tip: I did some cuts in the base with my hobby knife to give the glue something more to adhere to. And there the model is built. But before we can start painting it, we need to prime it. And primer is needed for the paint to have something to stick to. Painting straight on plastic, resin or metal usually doesn't end well. There's a few different ways to prime your models. You can get primer in a spray can, in a bottle to apply with a brush, or even with an airbrush if you have access to one. And here I'll show you how to do with the spray can. Make sure your spray can isn't cold. If it is, just heat it up with some warm water from the tap. And make sure you shake the spray can properly for about 2 minutes.
A few moments later.
Get a stick, some cardboard or something similar that you can attach your model to using sticky tack or double-sided tape so it won't fall off. Be sure to be in a well-ventilated room or outdoors when using the spray can. The fumes are quite nasty. Keep the spray can about 20 to 40 centimeters away from the model when spraying. Spray some light bursts while moving the spray can. Don't keep it still. That'll add too much paint in one spot and you might lose some detail. After that's done, let the primer get completely dry before starting to paint the model. The time it takes for the primer to fully dry differs a lot from primer to primer. And when using this spray can, the model is ready to get painted already after 15 minutes. But with this primer applied with an airbrush, you should wait 12 hours before painting. It's a good idea to check the label of the primer you're using. And now we're starting to get ready to paint. And of course we'll need some tools to be able to do that as well. Sure, you can hold your model in your hand when painting, but it does get a bit tricky. And that's why we use some kind of holders for the model. You can use a bit of wood, some cork or similar with a sticky tack on top to attach the model. Or if you have some money to spend, you can buy a holder that's made for this. Then you need some paint and brushes. When painting plastic miniatures, water-based acrylic paint is to be preferred. But when starting out you don't need that many different colors in my opinion. If you just have some basic ones and some black and white, you'll get far. Mixing your own paints is a really great skill to learn. And when it comes to brushes, I would recommend getting at least 3 different ones. But buying a cheap set of synthetic ones might be enough as well. I would recommend getting a semi-big one for base coating, metallics and shades. A smaller one for details and a dry brush for, well, dry brushing. I'll explain what that is shortly. If you feel like painting is something that you will continue to do, I highly recommend spending a bit extra on one brush which is made of good quality. Like a medium Kolinsky Sable brush. The difference compared to a synthetic brush is really big. And guys, I would just like to say that I'm really happy that my videos seem to help people out. That's the whole idea. And if you enjoyed this one, drop a roundhouse kick on both the like and the subscribe button.
Roadhouse.
Okay, now what? Is it just to dip the brush in the pots and start painting? Well, you could, but there are better ways. Either you use a normal palette or a wet palette. If you're using a normal palette, a plate or something like that, you firstly put some paint on it and then you thin it down with a little bit of water. The reason why you should do this is because the paint usually are way too thick coming straight from the pot, which will give your paint a texture and cover small details. If you just add a little bit of water, the paint will fill up the brush nicely and it will come smoothly off the brush. And when filling up your brush, make sure not to dip the whole brush in so you'll get paint up into the ferrule. That'll damage your brush when the paint dries. And there's not a universal water to paint ratio that I can teach you, because all paints are different. I can only show you the basics, then it's up to you, learning by doing. And then there's the wet palette, and this is really something I recommend that you will get if you're getting serious about painting. You can either buy one, or you can make one yourself. And it's really easy. One way to do it is to take some paper towels in a container and pour some water on it and put some baking parchment on top of it. Or you use like a plastic container and a dishcloth. In Sweden we have these ones called Wettex. They're really great at containing water. They're kinda spongy. Cut the dishcloth to fit inside of the container. Make it a little bit smaller because it will grow when you pour water on it. Cut your baking parchment up into small pieces that will fit nicely on your dishcloth. This kind of paper won't get saturated by the water, so it's a perfect surface to have your paint on. Then you pour some water in and put the baking parchment on top of it. You don't want to overdo it with water, so it'll pour up on the parchment. Now it's really easy to thin down your paints or mix paints together. And the best thing with using a wet palette is that the paints won't dry up as fast as when using a normal palette. If the dishcloth is starting to get dry during a long painting session, you can just top it up with some more water. And then you'll need a cup of water to rinse your brush. Well, rather 2 cups if you're going to use metallic paints. Otherwise the metallic pigments will make your normal paint layer sparkle, and you probably don't want that. And you'll also need some paper towels. And after rinsing your brush in the cup, make sure to wipe off the excess water on the paper towel, so you won't have any water in your brush or on the handle. You don't want to thin down your paints more than necessary, and you don't want that extra drop to come down on your model while you are painting. And proper lighting is important now when we're getting into the painting stage. Sure, you need a good lighting when building as well, but it's more important when painting. Just changing the light bulb in your current lamp to a daylight bulb might do a big difference. So let's start painting. Make sure you shake your paints well before use. Firstly, we put on the base coats all over the miniature. We don't need to be that careful since we're going to be putting other layers after these ones. When you thin your paints down, they might look a bit dull after just one layer. So slap another layer on top of that one and...
Ta-da!
Then it's on to the details. Now you need to be a bit more careful. But if you would brush paint on places where it shouldn't be, and you will, then it's just to switch back to the base coating colors and do a touch-up. And don't worry, it will take several layers of thinned down paint before detail starts to be covered. Don't be afraid to mix your colors, and don't use your fine expensive brush for your metallic paints and shades. Now we have all our coats on the Mini, but it probably looks quite colorful and not quite right, so let's put on some shade. And shades is a very thin, usually darker liquid that will flow into the recesses of your miniature and give your model more depth. Some call it magic in a pot, and it really is handy for us who haven't yet mastered the painting skill to paint the shading ourselves. Don't overdo it, and don't let it pool too much in deep recesses. Two of the popular shades are Nuln Oil and Agrax Earth Shade from Citadel. Nuln Oil are great for silver, grey and bone colors, and Agrax Earth Shade works great with gold, brown and other grimy colors. After that we can do some highlighting if you want to go the extra mile to make the Mini pop. If you want to make it look like the light is coming from above, paint a brighter layer on top of your higher base coats. And edge highlighting means that we make the sharp parts of the model brighter. A tip here is to use the side of the brush for the parts where it's possible. And here we can use quite a bright color. If you have eyes on the model that you would like to paint, I firstly suggest that you use a really small brush, starting out with the darker area around the actual eye, followed with the white eye, and then when painting the pupil I recommend making the strokes with the tip of the brush going up and down vertical with the face. And now it's time to paint the base.
All your base art belong to us.
And I'm gonna make it easy on myself and just paint it dark and dry brush it with a brighter grey. Now when we go into dry brush we need another kind of brush. The brush Solderson dry brush is a good option, but you can also use old brushes and cut off a bit of the tip. Or when working on bigger pieces you can buy cheap makeup brushes to use. Dip the brush in some paint and rub most of it off on a paper towel. Doing this on the side of the wet palette is to be preferred, because you don't want the dry brush to get wet. That might just make your paint messy. Double check that you got most of the paint off by brushing a bit on your hand. When you're happy with the amount of paint, you can start brushing over the base. The idea is to only put paint on the raised edges, creating a highlight that's a lot faster than when doing it with normal highlighting. And as a final touch, paint the rim of your base in a solid color. I prefer and recommend black to make it look clean. And I think that is totally fine for a tabletop standard model. If you guys want to see some epic paint jobs and get some pro tips when it comes to painting, I do recommend checking out these guys. Their content is great, and I mean, check out this beard. That's all for me, guys. Thanks for stopping by, I wish you all the best, and until next time, pew!